Hello, everyone. To get started, we're going to want to access the project I made, which contains all of the exercises for today. In order to do that, we will need to set the project. Now, what does that mean? Well, a project in Maya is a folder which basically contains a series of subfolders which come with predetermined names that Maya knows to look for when linking files together in your scene. In other words, if you don't do this step, Maya won't know where to find your files. So let's say you've got a scene with a whole bunch of beautiful textures and all of the images for those textures are stored in your project folder. But the next time you try to start your scene again, you forget to set the project and Maya then doesn't know where to find those images. Then the references to those images will be broken and your scene will look blank. So to set the project, I'm going to copy the path to my project folder. And then I'm just going to move this aside. I'm going to go over here to this button, which lets me set the project. I'm going to paste that address up here, and I'm just going to select the project folder, and I'm not going to double click it. I'm not going to go into it. I'm just going to select the project folder and then hit set. And from there, we can see the current project is now that modeling intro project. And now I can just go to open, and it takes me directly to the scenes folder within my project folder. And there is only one scene, so I'm going to go ahead and open that one. Now, if you did this correctly, you should be able to go up to here and press this button right here. It looks like a little circle with a checkerboard pattern inside. If you click it, it will turn on your textures. If you do this correctly, you should see a green check mark right here. That is because the green check mark image is a file within our project folder. So if I were to go into here and then go into source images, I can see that check mark right here. And so Maya knows to look in this exact spot to find this check mark and display it here. I know that was a pretty lengthy explanation, but it is important to keep this in mind whenever you're returning to a project, that you always need to set the project first so that Maya knows where to look for all your files. So with that out of the way, now we are in our proper scene. Right in the middle of the Maya interface is our viewport. This is our sort of window into our scene. We can navigate around the viewport if we hold the Alt key and then left click allows us to rotate our camera around the viewport. If we hold Alt and middle click, we can pan. And then if we hold Alt and right click, we can zoom. You can also zoom with the scroll wheel as well. Just above our viewport is our shelves. These are convenient collections of commonly used functions which are categorized for different purposes. So by default, we are in the polymodeling shelf, but there is also a sculpting shelf, a rigging shelf, animation, etc., etc. But for now, let's just stick with the polymodeling shelf. And these are tools that are really useful for modeling. And on the far left, we have buttons which will add primitive shapes to our scene. So let's go ahead and start by adding a cube. When you create a primitive, it starts out selected, and then when you have an object selected, you can zoom in on it by pressing the F key on the keyboard. Now we can tell if this object is selected because all of the lines are highlighted green. Now you may have noticed that when I added this cube to the scene, it was also added over here in the left column under the name pCube2. This column is called the outliner, and it essentially is a list of all the objects in our scene. And not only that, it can also be used to sort of categorize them under groups and hierarchies, which are useful to us. So for example, if I were to make a second cube, and I can select them both by holding Shift and then selecting the second cube. I can see they're now both selected. And then I can hit Control G to place them in a group. And what happens when these objects are in a group is I can then move the group itself, and all the objects within the group move together with the group as one. And then I could go back and select an individual object within the group and move it. individually, and then I can select the group again and move them together. So grouping can be a really useful way to move objects together and organize your scene. But for now, I'm going to get rid of this group by going up to Edit, Ungroup. And I'll just delete that extra cube and move my other cube back. Perhaps more accurately, the edges are green. Now, this would probably be a good time to talk about polygons. So, polygons are a series of points connected by edges, then filled in with faces, which create a form in 3D space. These forms are called polygon meshes, or sometimes just 3D models. Stepping aside for a second, let's talk about polygons and the number of sides that they can have. So there are three main categories of polygons. There are quads, which are 4 sides, 4 vertices. Then there are tris, or triangles, which are 3 sides and 3 vertices. And then there is everything that is larger than 4. These are generally called n-gons, where n is just a placeholder to describe anything more than 4. So 5, 6, 7, 8 sides, you name it. Now, generally the old conventional wisdom is that you want your model to be made out of almost entirely quads. And while it is true that it is generally easier to work with quads most of the time, there can be certain scenarios where it's hard to get 100% quads. So it's okay to have some triangles in your model. And then n-gons, on the other hand, well, there's really nothing wrong with them either per se. But when you get to these sorts of shapes, sometimes Maya kind of makes up its own rules about how it would be shaped if these vertices start getting away from each other in anything that's not a flat shape. So n-gons can be a little unpredictable. And so they're sort of considered by a lot of people to be unprofessional or just bad geometry to have in your models. Now, I think there may be some rare instances where n-gons are okay, but while you're just starting out, I would recommend just avoiding n-gons entirely. All right, and we're back at our scene. Now, right now we have the entire model selected, but we can go into the model and start selecting those individual components of the polygons. So, for example, if I hold right-click, it'll bring up this menu, and then if I drag my mouse over vertex, I can then select those vertices or those points that make up the cube. Same thing with the edges and the faces. And then if I want to go back to selecting the whole cube again, I can just go back to object mode. Now with our cube selected, let's go ahead and solve our first problem, and that is to create a cube and place it here. So to move this cube, I'm going to go ahead and press the W key on my keyboard. That will transition me from the select mode to the translate mode, which could also be thought of as just the move mode. While in translate mode, my object has this gizmo over it with 3 handles pointing in 3 different directions. These are the 3 axes which this object can be moved in 3D space. So if I grab one of these handles and then drag, I can move my cube along this axis. Or if I grab this handle, I can move it along that axis. Or if I grab one of these squares in between these arrows, I can move along 2 axes at the same time. Same thing down here. And if I grab this square in the middle, I can move in relation to the camera rather than any of these 3 directions. Now these colors are not random. Each of these colors corresponds to a specific axis. And you can find out what that axis is by looking down here in the bottom left corner of your viewport. You can see there is a identical gizmo to the one here, which tells me exactly what each of these directions is. So the red handle corresponds to the x-axis. The green handle corresponds to the y-axis, and the blue handle corresponds to the z-axis. And so when I grab this red handle, my cube is moving along in the x-axis. And while I'm doing that, look over here on the right. This column over here, which we haven't talked about yet, is called the channel box / layer editor. There's a couple other tabs here as well, but for now, let's just focus on the channel box. So as I move along in the x-axis, you can see this number changing up here, translate x. These three numbers right here are the coordinates of my object in world space. So as I move my object around, it is changing that number. Same thing for the z-axis and the y-axis. And with that in mind, I'm not actually limited to just moving my object with the handles. I can also move my object by typing in numbers here. So if I type 1, 1 there, or I could type into multiple channels by clicking and dragging down through multiple boxes and then typing in my value in the last box. Or if I wanted to, I could grab right here in between the input box and the name of the channel and could just click and drag. Whoop, and I've lost sight of my cube, so I'm just going to set that back to 0. Translating isn't exclusive to just the whole object, though, as we can go back to our component modes and select various components on our cube here, and we can start to translate those around. And this lets us create new shapes. Same thing with edges. And faces. All right. Now this did say to place a cube there, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Probably pressing the delete key on my keyboard because it's not looking like a cube anymore. And then I'm going to go back here up to the cube, make a new one, and I'm going to place it here. It doesn't need to be exact, just approximately there in the center. Now you may have noticed that when I added this cube to the scene, it was also added over here in the left column under the name pCube2. This column is called the outliner, and it essentially is a list of all the objects in our scene. And not only that, it can also be used to sort of categorize them under groups and hierarchies, which are useful to us. So for example, if I were to make a second cube, and I can select them both by holding Shift and then selecting the second cube, I can see they're now both selected. And then I can hit Control G to place them in a group. And what happens when these objects are in a group is I can then move the group itself, and all the objects within the group move together with the group as one. And then I could go back and select an individual object within the group and move it individually, and then I can select the group again and move them together. So grouping can be a really useful way to move objects together and organize your scene. But for now, I'm going to get rid of this group by going up to Edit, Ungroup. And I'll just delete that extra cube and move my other cube back. And now that we've made a change, it's a great time to save. So to do that, I'm going to go up to File, and then I have a couple different options here. I could hit Save Scene, which will just overwrite the save of the scene that I already have saved. I could also hit Save Scene As to save a new version of the scene as a separate file. Now when working on productions, oftentimes they'll ask you to name them in a format something like this, where it's the name of your scene plus your initials, so I'll put TF for my own, and then the version number of your scene. So I'm going to save my scene in that format. And then there are two main scene file types in Maya. There is .ma and .mb. which stands for my binary. I'm going to leave mine as my MA, which is my ASCII. The differences are pretty minute, but just know that there is a difference between my ASCII and my binary. Maybe we'll get into that at a later point. Finally, if I wanted a quicker way to save my scene, but save incremental versions, let's say I made a little change, like move this slightly up, and I just want to save a new version, but without having to go through the process of renaming it. Well, I could go to File, and then Increment and Save. And what that does is it will automatically save a new version of my scene with a new name that's just that number that I left after my initial, but one number higher. So now the file I'm working on is intro to modeling.tf.0002.ma. So it's a great way to have lots of different versions in case something goes wrong along the way. So you can go back to a version where things weren't broken. On to our next problem. This says to rotate this cube and scale it up. So I'm going to select this cube, and now I'm going to switch to my rotate tool. And that I can access by pressing the E key. And it's very much like the translate tool. Again, the colors correspond to different axes in the world. So if I grab this handle, I'm now rotating on the x-axis. So one way to think of it is like if you're to go to translate and the x-axis is like a pole that goes straight through the cube. If I were to then rotate, I'm rotating around that pole. Same thing with the green one and the blue one. Now you may notice that as I rotate this cube, the other handles to rotate this are rotating with it. Now, as it turns out, this cube is actually rotating in something called object space rather than world space. So while we were moving this object around in world space, that means that we were moving it around in the world's coordinate system. Whereas while we're rotating it around in object space, that means we are rotating it in the coordinate system from the object's point of view. It sounds a little bit confusing on paper, but it's better if I just show you what it means if I were to switch the rotation to world space. So I'm going to hold E, and I'm going to click with my left mouse. And while holding the left mouse, it brings up this menu. And I'm going to ignore all these other options. I'm just going to focus on object and world. So I'm going to switch to world space now. And you can see now my gizmos don't change as I rotate the object, because we're now working off of the world's coordinate system. We can do the same thing with the translation tool as well. So if I go to the translate tool and I'm going to hold W and then hold down the left mouse button again, I can switch this to object mode. And now my axes are pointed in the object's point of view. So now I can move in these very different directions. And then if I want to go back, I just hold W, hold left mouse, and go back to world space. So that's one half of the problem, but I also need to scale it up. So to scale, I'm going to press the R key. And just like the other two tools, this one also has a object space and a world space option. So I'm going to hold R, left click, and I'm going to switch to the world space. And just like the other tools, I can scale in one axis, or two, or all three. So I'm just going to move this up, scale it up. And one last thing, it says to duplicate it. So to duplicate an object, you can hit Control and D. And then it might not look like I've duplicated it until I drag this up. My next problem is to delete this cube. Now I deleted an object earlier, but again, just press the delete key to delete an object. Next up, extrude faces from this cube any number of times. Well, to do that, we're going to need to go back into our face mode. So I'm going to go to face. I'm just going to select this face. So to extrude this face, all I need to do is go up to here and press this button. If I hover my mouse over a shelf button for a little while, it'll give you the name and a short description of the function. And so this says extrude, extend new vertices / edges / faces from existing spots on the mesh. So I'm going to click it, and it doesn't look like anything happened. But if I drag out this gizmo, I can see that it lets me drag out that face and has created new faces to sort of stretch out from that spot. Not only that, before I click off of here, I have this little menu to give me additional control over this extrude tool. So I can change the thickness of this extrusion or the local translation. Thickness and translation are pretty similar. I can also change the offset, which makes this new face larger or smaller. I can also add divisions to my extrusion. So extruding is one of the really valuable bread and butter tools we have at our disposal to make new shapes from simple primitives. So if you just keep going, you can just keep extruding out and adding more geometry to your model. This isn't the only spot to access the extrude tool. There's also a convenient tab over here called the Modeling Toolkit. And this gives us several of those tools that we see up here on the shelf, as well as some additional options. Like, for example, we can turn on and off symmetry from here. So say if I were to click this and hit Object X, I can then select just one side of this object. And then anything I do to one side happens to the other. Now that is specific to the x-axis. So if we remember, the x-axis is the one going along this way. So it's specifically putting a split down the middle of my object that goes in the positive and negative directions of the x-axis. If you're not a big fan of holding right-click to change between different component modes, you can also use the Modeling Toolkit to switch between component modes. So I can go to edges or vertices. Or back to faces. And back to object mode, all from right up here. So that's enough for that one for now. Let's move on to the next problem. This says to extrude the top edges of this cylinder. So we're not limited to just extruding faces, we can also extrude edges. So I'm going to go to edge mode. I'm going to select this. I'm going to turn off symmetry for now. So I'm going to go there, turn that off. And I want to select all of these edges before I extrude them. Now, thankfully, all these edges are all arranged in what's known as an edge loop. An edge loop basically means that you can connect all of these edges around in a clean loop. If you get tired of seeing the gizmo, if that's getting in their way, you can press Q to go to your selection mode and just get rid of it. And then you're not at risk of accidentally manipulating things you didn't mean to. But the great thing about an edge loop is if you double click just one edge that's part of an edge loop, you will select the whole edge loop. So it's a really fast way to save time rather than holding shift and individually clicking each of these edges. You can just double click one edge and it goes all the way around. And then from there, I can just hit extrude. Drag that up. There's also one more way to extrude. I'm going to click outside of my object to end that extrude tool. And then I'm going to double click these again. And I'm just going to go to my translate mode, hold shift, and drag up. And that lets me extrude in any direction that I translate. It works the same as well with rotation. So I can hold shift and rotate, and I'll get faces that way. And scale. So if I were to hold shift and then scale this in, I can extrude like that. So that's a nice, arguably quicker way to extrude sometimes, though you don't have all the fine controls that you do when you actually hit the extrude button. So there are pros and cons to each. Next up, we have the Multicut tool. So the Multicut tool lets us place vertices connected by edges to basically divide up our geometry into more dense clusters of polygons. So to use the Multicut tool, I can either click up here in the shelf or down here in the modeling toolkit. And I forgot to select this plane, so I'm going to hit Q to exit out of the Multicut tool. I'm going to select the object. I'm going to go to edge mode, and I'm going to go back to the Multicut tool. And if I just click anywhere on one of these edges, I can place a vertex, and then click somewhere else. And it shows a line between point A and point B. Now this isn't being set yet. Once I have selected this, I can still move these vertices around. And I can even start clicking more points. And it's not until I hit enter do those become confirmed, and those are made into edges. Now that's a pretty imprecise way to go about using the Multicut tool. As you can see up here though, it says that I can hold shift to lock to the center of an edge. So let me hit Control Z to undo all of that. And go back to my Multicut tool, and I'm gonna hold shift, and you can see that there's this black square right in the middle of this edge. If I hit click, it snaps right to that center. And if I hold click, I can slide along in 10% increments to get a really precise value. So I'm just going to hit enter. And you'll notice if I cross over an edge too, it will add a vertex to this middle edge as well. So I don't have to just go like 1, 2, 3. I can just cut across all these edges and it will automatically add vertices to each of them. And there we go. And so now once there was one face, there's now 12 faces. And this could be useful, say, if you were to, I don't know, go and select all these faces and then hit extrude. Or if you just wanted to pull these out or extrude them in. Moving on to the next problem. Using the Multicut tool, hold Control to create edge loops. So here we have two different objects we can practice this on. We have a cube and a cylinder. And I'm going to hold Control, and as you can see, it actually allows me to create an edge loop around this whole shape. That's because edge loops also work for faces as well. So you can see, so if I were to go to face mode and then select this face, well, if I were to select this face, double click it, I would just select all the faces because it doesn't know what direction I want. But if I were to select one face and then double click an adjacent face, it will loop around to get back to that first face again. Same thing with the cylinder here. If I just double click a face, it selects all of them. But if I select this face and then double click an adjacent face, it selects all in the loop. And so with that logic in mind, we can use that to use the Multicut tool and make loops around our object. Very quickly, we're able to divide up our object into these clean loops. And once again, that could be used for all sorts of things, like making these kind of shapes. So the next task is to delete edges until the plane consists of one face. And let's assume we want to make one face with just 4 edges and 4 vertices. And now it seems like it might be pretty straightforward. You would just go to edge mode and start deleting edges, right? So if I double click this edge, it'll select all these connected edges, and I'm just gonna hit the delete key. And it looked like it deleted everything just fine, right? But if you go to vertex mode, you can actually see that it left behind all of those vertices still. And that can be really inconvenient because you might want these to be just plain faces with 4 sides, but they actually have 6 sides and you don't even know it. So to avoid this, I'm going to go ahead and select all of my edges. And instead, I'm going to follow the instruction below. I'm going to hit Control Delete. And by doing that, and then going back to vertex mode, I can see that it's deleted all the vertices. Well, it should have deleted all of those vertices, but it's left one of them for some reason. But that's pretty easy to clean up. I can just click it, hit delete. So sometimes it is not foolproof. Sometimes a lot of things in Maya are not foolproof, so it's always good to double check things. You'll find that Maya will do a lot of silly things sometimes. Moving on to the next task. Combine these 2 planes and use the bridge tool to close the gap between them. So these are 2 separate objects. We want to combine them into one solid piece. Now this is a 2-step process because they are technically 2 different objects and there's no way to connect them currently. So to combine them, I'm going to hold Shift and select them both. And then I'm going to hit the Combine tool. And that turns them into one object. So if I select them, they're both green. And now with them as one object, I'm going to go ahead and hold right click. I'm going to go to Edges. I'm going to go ahead and bridge the gap here. To do that, I'm going to select all these edges. And I count there's a equal number of edges on each side. There's 5. And it's good. So with that, I can hit the bridge tool right here or right here. And it automatically fills in the space with new faces. There we go. Same thing over here. Combine the parts and bridge the gaps in the torus. So we've got 4 parts this time. I can hit combine. And then I'm going to go over here. And I'm just going to double click, hit bridge. It fills right in. And similar to the extrude tool, there's also a little menu that pops up that gives me some different sliders to work with. So I can add a bit of a twist. If I add some divisions, have it taper in. So there's a lot of different values to play with. But for this, that's beyond repair. I'm going to undo that. I just want a plain bridge like this, plain and simple. I'll repeat the same steps. Now, since the last tool I used was the bridge tool, I could also just hit the G key to repeat my last function. So that repeats the bridge function again. So it saves a lot of time instead of having to go back to the bridge button every time. I can just hit G, double click, and hit G again. There you go. Moving on over here. Once again, we have combined these 2 planes, but this time use the target wheel tool to close the gap. So similar situation, I'm going to combine them both. And this time I'm going to use the target wheel tool, which is over here or right here. And what target wheel does is it connects 2 vertices together and merges them into one vertice. So when using the modeling toolkit, it gives me the option here to either merge to target or merge to center. So if I merge to target, I can drag from one vertex and go to another, and it will merge to the second vertex that I dragged it to. Whereas if I merge to center, you can see there's a little green dot between the 2 vertices, and when I release, it will merge them to that green dot. I'm going to go ahead and undo that first one and just merge all of these to center. And this is a nice quick way to stitch up a gap rather than bridge tool, which fills it in. All right, moving on. Now I have to use the fill tool to replace the missing face. So I'm going to go in here. There's a face missing in the middle. This is really easy. I'm going to just select all 4 of these edges. And the fill tool isn't present here in the modeling toolkit, nor is it here in the shelves either. Now there are more tools to be found rather than just what's in those shelves and the modeling toolkit. As you can see up here in my menus, there's actually several menus which have the word mesh in them, and all of them have modeling tools in them. So if I go up here to mesh, I can find fill hole right here. When I click that, it simply fills the hole. Now if I was just a really big fan of the fill hole tool, I could actually add it to my shelf up here. To do that, I can go to mesh, and with Control and Shift selected, I'm going to click fill hole again. And when I did that, it popped up here at the end of my shelf. And then all I have to do is middle mouse drag this to wherever I want. So I can just put it there. And now I can use that tool at any time from the shelf. If you wanted to get creative, you could rearrange all of your shelves. And you could even make new shelves. If you go over here to this gearbox, and there's a whole host of tools, which I'm not going to get into, but if you want to explore, there's all sorts of options to set up custom shelves. Moving on, we have combine and bridge once again, but you may notice there's something a little bit different this time. Now there are 5 edges on top here and 3 edges on the bottom here. So if I try to bridge these, it won't work because they're not an equal number of edges. It doesn't know how it should bridge this. So I need to do some more manual work here. And this is where a lot of the problem solving of modeling comes into play. So I need to figure out how I want to arrange these faces in the middle here. An easy start would be to grab these 2, hit bridge, same thing over here, hit G to bridge again. And now I'm left with 1 face to 3 faces. Well, what I could do is I could grab this edge and this edge, fill that in there. And now if you notice, there's room for 1 4-side polygon right here. So I can grab these 2. So I can grab these and can fill the hole. And if I wanted to even make this look a bit smoother, I can select all these vertices. I'm going to use something that we haven't used yet until now. I'm going to hold Shift and hold right click to open up the contextual menu. And the contextual menu just has a bunch of very specific tools for whatever component mode I'm in. So if I were to do this while I was, say, in edge mode and hold Shift and right click, I'd get a completely different set of tools. These are all tools that just have to do with edges. But getting back to vertice mode, I'm going to hold Shift and right click and hit average vertices. I'm going to hit G a couple times. It's just going to average out those vertices to make this transition a little bit smoother. Careful when doing it on edges though. See, it just collapsed the whole shape of my form there. And I didn't really want that. So I'm going to undo. I'm just going to leave it to the middle ones. Moving on. Look at that. It's combine and bridge once more. But this time the math is a little bit different again. Now it's 5 to 4, which is not going to be quite as simple as the last one. So I'm going to go to edges. I'm going to start the same as before. Bridge, bridge, bridge. You can bridge there. You can bridge here. But now there's a conundrum. So the question is, do I want to give myself a triangle here? Or do I want to try and figure out how to make this a quad? And this is where my modeler sense will have to sort of make a judgment call here. Now, depending on the project and depending on where this is, it might be perfectly fine to just leave a triangle here. So just select those edges and do fill hole. and that's maybe fine. But you might be in a situation where you are being required to use quads. Well, you could go in and use the Multicut tool to add a whole edge loop here. You can even just even this out by raising the vertex a little bit. And so now you have quads, but at the sacrifice of having more complex geometry than you had before, because now you've got 6 faces up here where there was once 3. There are advantages and disadvantages to triangles and quads. While it can be difficult to maintain quads throughout an entire model, the benefit is that you can maintain all those nice clean edge loops for when you're working with the model. But sometimes you are going to just add a lot more complication trying to maintain a bunch of quads when one triangle could fix your problem. So over time, as you model more and more, these sort of decisions and problem solving will become easier. But you probably run into this when you're beginning modeling, and it will take a while to sort of wrap your brain around what to do in these kind of situations where you're trying to go from 4 edges to 5 or 3 edges to 5. And then moving on over here, center the pivot, delete the history, and freeze the transformations. So if we look at this cat here, and we go back to our channel blocks, there are a couple things to note. First of all, if we expand this window, if we scroll down, there are a lot of these little inputs here. There's polysplit, polytweak, polysplit, polysplit, polytweak. So as you work on a model, everything you do to it is actually recorded as an input or history. And the more you work on it, the longer this list of inputs becomes. And sometimes they're necessary if you're working with deformers or if you are rigging a character. But for the most part, when you're just modeling like this, that's pretty much just junk. You know, the more you have, it's just going to eat up more RAM, and then every additional tweak or change you make to the model is just going to take longer and longer, and it's just going to be a huge pain. So the way to handle this, though, is really easy. All you have to do is go up to here and hit this button to delete by type history. Now, it's called delete by type because that's actually a function up here in edit. And you can go down here to delete by type, and you can delete things of different types. But the main thing we are concerned about usually is going to be history. So that's why there's a button right here on the shelf. So that's one of the tasks. We also have to center the pivot. So if I go to my translate tool, you'll notice that the gizmo is very far off from the center of the model. In fact, it's just way outside of it. So pivots are not always at the center of a model. They can be really anywhere. But sometimes we want to bring them back to the center. Because if I were to, say, rotate this, I'm not able to just rotate the cat normally. It's like swinging around this pivot. So if I want to recenter this pivot, I just have to hit this button right next to delete history, center pivot. And now when I rotate, it's rotating right around that pivot. And then finally, as I move things around and rotate them and scale them, it changes their values here in the channel box. But sometimes I want things to just have a permanent position in my scene. And I want that to be sort of their default. I want this to remain here, but I want all these values here to be 0. Well, what I can do is I can hit freeze transformations. And it takes all those values and sets them to 0 while leaving the object in place, making this its new default position in the world space. So with that, this model is now clean. The pivot's a great spot. We can leave it alone. Moving over here, now we have to manually move the pivot, and we are going to mirror this cat model. So if we go over here, we can see that the pivot actually is centered on the model, at least the half of the model that's still remaining. But I would like to move this pivot to this middle dividing line. So I'm going to hit D, and that changes my gizmo. You can see now it's got both the rotating and the translating tools. So now that I've hit D, when I manipulate this gizmo, it's no longer moving the object. Now it's moving just the pivot. And so now I can move this pivot to be anywhere I want. And I actually would like it to be exactly in the middle here without using the center pivot tool, because the center pivot tool would just put it in this area. So if I want to snap right to the middle here, I could actually turn on vertex snapping by going up to here, or snap to points, excuse me. And now with that turned on, I'm going to click this, I'm going to drag it, and it snaps right to the center there. It just snaps to the nearest point. I can also use this with my keyboard if I'm going to move the pivot out again. And if I just hold V, you can see that same button highlights, but if I release V, that turns off. So that's a really quick way to just snap it. And sometimes it's nice to have your pivots on the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and hold V again. And I'm just going to snap it all the way right to the bottom there. And then to confirm, I just hit D again. And there we go. That's just one step. Next step, I want to mirror the cat. So to do that, I'm going to go up to here. I'm going to hit the mirror tool. Now, when you hit the mirror tool, sometimes it doesn't look like anything happened, or sometimes it looks like something broke. It really depends. Every time you use the mirror tool, you'll usually have to play with these settings here to get the intended effect. So what's happening right now is it is mirroring along the world center. So if I were to zoom out, I'd find that the other half of the cat is way over there because it's taking this half of the cat and then mirroring it along that point in the very middle of the entire world. And that's not quite what I want. So I'm going to open Axis Position, and so I'm going to go to Object. Well, that did something. But now it seems to be sort of caving in on itself. That's because it is mirroring in the negative direction, whereas I'd like it to go in the positive direction. And there we go. We have a perfect mirror. Now, it's important to note that sometimes you may have vertices that are not perfectly on your center if you are doing a mirror like this. And if you use the mirror tool, set it to world, set it to positive, depending on where your merge threshold is at, it may or may not merge those vertices that are not perfectly in the middle of the object. And sometimes this is an intended effect for you, and sometimes it's not. So it's important to be aware of what the merge threshold is and what it's doing to your mesh. And now that you know what history is, it's a good idea to be continually clearing your history. That way it'll become a habit and you won't forget and find your model becoming really bogged down. So see, since I mirrored it, it has poly mirror 1. So I'm going to go up here to history and delete that. Next up, smooth this cube via the smooth tool. So that's simple enough. I'm going to select this cube. I'm going to go to modeling toolkit. I'm going to hit smooth. And what that's done is it's divided up the cube into smaller shapes. And if I keep adding divisions, it'll just keep dividing and dividing until eventually we get a sphere. And so it's important to note that these are all real faces that I can then manipulate. And it's a very, very dense collection of faces. This would not be an easy model to work with now that I've divided it up so finely. So it's a very destructive way of smoothing a model. So let's say you want to have a model look really smooth, but you don't want it to be quite so destructive. You want to be still working on it in its simpler form while getting that smooth look. Well, we're going to move on to the next task where we are going to smooth this cube via smooth preview. Now, this is going to be different from smooth. For smoothing the model, we use the smooth tool. But for smooth preview, we're just going to press the 3 key. So I'm select my model, hit 3. And just like that, it becomes smooth, just like the square over there did. But if you notice, there's not actually any more sides. If I hit 1, it goes back to the square it was before. So hitting the 3 key never actually changes the geometry, but it changes the way Maya is sort of presenting that geometry. Another way to think of it, and perhaps the more accurate way, is that Smooth Preview shows you what your model would look like if the polygons were subdivided without actually going through and permanently subdividing them. This saves you from the headache of making changes to a subdivided model while also saving computer resources when working with what would have been a very high density model. If you hit 2, it'll actually show you both the literal geometry as well as sort of the interpreted smooth geometry. So this is really good if you want to have a really smooth look to your model without bogging it down with far more faces than it needs. But let's say you wanted to smooth out this cube so it looks like it has some smoothness to these corners, but you don't want it to just collapse in on itself like this. Well, that's where fencing comes into play. So we're going to add fencing to this cube, which basically means we're going to add edges near these corners so that when you smooth or smooth preview your model, you won't lose those hard corners. Because when you subdivide a model, how much an area between 2 vertices is smoothed out is determined by how much distance there is between those vertices. So if you add edges near those corners, there will be a lot less distance for the vertices to be averaged between. It's hard to really explain with words, so it's better to just show you. So you can see in this corner, I've added these edges right here, and it's really dense. And when it subdivides with the smooth preview, you can see it still really maintains its shape. Whereas on this side where I didn't add any fencing, it collapses in on itself because there's not any really supports, so to say. So if I go through, do the rest of the multi-cutting, I could get a cube that actually looks like kind of cube you would get in real life, where it doesn't have a perfectly sharp edge, but the edges are sharp enough that they register as a corner to us. You can also get this kind of fencing even quicker if instead of using the multi-cut tool, you select all these edges and then hit the bevel tool, which can be found here or here. I'm gonna hit bevel, and this goes around and it just divides all of my edges up. Now by default, it gets rid of the edge in the middle, but you can turn chamfer off, and then now it's just adding edges. And you can change how far away they are from the original edge. You can add segments. If you turn chamfering off, it even gets that smooth look without even having to do the smooth preview. But you're dealing with the problem of having dense geometry and it starts to bog down your model. So it's really kind of situational in that sense. But beveling is a super cool, super fast way to get that sort of fencing going. And it looks a lot more even than when I did it by hand, where I was just kind of eyeballing it. And then finally, our last problem. So the face in the middle has an inverted normal. Select the face and then go to Mesh, Display, Reverse to fix it. So what does that mean, a reverse normal? That's something we haven't really talked about until this point. But every polygon is comprised of 4 things, actually. It's comprised of vertices, edges, faces, and normals. And normals are essentially the direction that your face is actually facing. So if your faces are gray like this, or whatever material they're supposed to be, then that is the direction that the normal is facing. But if you go to this other side, you'll see that all of these faces are pitch black, and they aren't being affected by even the sort of fake lighting in the viewport. This is the underside. This is the side that the normal is facing away from, except for this middle one, where the normal is reversed. It's not consistent with the other faces. So to fix this, we're going to go to Face, Mesh Display, Reverse. And there you go. Now it's fixed. And there you have it. That's the end of the problems. So thank you very much for sticking around, and I hope you have a good one.